And Finland's leader says the country should apply for NATO membership without delay. The Kremlin says the Finnish decision is definitely a threat to Russia and will not bring stability to Europe or the world. Well, let's get more. Ollie Barrett joins us from Riga, Latvia. Ollie, Russia says it will be forced to take retaliatory steps against Finland joining NATO, such as, what could Moscow do?
Well, it's talking about military, technical and other steps, but not getting any detail as yet from Moscow on what exactly those steps might look like. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov's been saying that to start with, Russia needs to see exactly what is going to unfold in the coming months in terms of perhaps a boosted NATO troop presence in Finland and Sweden, if indeed they do go ahead and join up with the military alliance. Certainly the language that Moscow is using is quite similar actually to the language it used ahead of the invasion of Ukraine, but I don't think anyone in Western capitals seriously expects that Vladimir Putin is planning to invade Finland or Sweden anytime soon, not least because he's currently so committed inside Ukraine and with his troops in many parts of Ukraine not doing particularly well, according to Western intelligence updates anyway. Certainly, officials in Europe will be braced for the potential of things like cyber security attacks of some sort or another. And I think absolutely Western capitals will also expect to see a movement of military hardware from the Russian side of the border, perhaps strengthening its own defences along the border with Finland, for example.
Exactly that, because the Kremlin is saying that Russia needs to strengthen its security of the region on the border with Ukraine. Is the war spreading into Russia's borders?
I'm not sure that's what we're seeing at this stage, but we are absolutely going to be seeing Russia looking at its own hardware and the positioning of a lot of it and the strengthening or otherwise of its own defences inside its borders. And one of the other things that we are, of course, looking at from here in Latvia is the Baltic positioning as well. The Krišjānis Kariņš, who's the Prime Minister of Latvia, he says he sincerely welcomes this announcement. He says it's an important turn towards what he calls an even stronger alliance, and he says it brings greater security in the Baltic Sea region. And some of the Baltic nations are looking at what's happening with the application that we think will come from Finland and Sweden to join the NATO military alliance, and saying that's a very good thing, but we still need further boosting of NATO forces in our countries as well. So that's something to keep an eye on too. The UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson today, by the way, saying that he doesn't think relations with Vladimir Putin in Moscow can ever really be normalised again. So this is all to be viewed in that context as well.
All right, Ollie Barrett in Riga, thank you for those updates.
And from all this story, we're joined now by Kia Giles, Senior Consulting Fellow, Russia and Eurasia Programme, Chatham House. He joins us live from Northamptonshire in England. Kia, we heard, actually a very vocal advocate for Finland joining NATO has been former PM, that's Alexander Stubb, and he has said on this matter, it may seem politically significant, but actually it's very natural. Nothing surprising about this. But then we've had the current Prime Minister no later than January this year saying she did not think Finland would be joining NATO in her term. So with the benefit of hindsight now, do you think this move by Finland is significant?
It is, but then those comments, those contradictory comments that you just repeated, they are reflective of the fact that there's never been a good time for Finland to join NATO and there's never been a bad time, because the situation as far as Finland is concerned has been exactly the same throughout all of the period they've been discussing NATO membership, which goes back decades with a very gradual move towards this position we have now when they're willing to join. But of course, it is Russia's actions, not the ones they're threatening in the future, but the ones they've already taken, that have pushed Finnish political and public opinion over the edge. It's the central paradox of Russia wanting security for itself. Every time it threatens a neighbor, it proves to that neighbor why exactly it needs to join NATO. And so every time they make threats trying to persuade countries not to join NATO, it has the exact opposite effect. And that's exactly what we're seeing playing out in Finland today.
But as you say, even if it's Russia's actions that swayed public opinion, what Finland has done diplomatically and militarily, it's very much in line with joining NATO in terms of its military preparedness, its the training of its people, even the amount of money of its GDP that it puts into defense spending every year. It actually meets NATO's guideline, which many other countries do not meet, including NATO members. So this is pretty much a very natural progression for Finland.
That's exactly right. Yes, NATO has always worked very closely with Finland and vice versa. And even though they weren't strictly speaking an ally of the alliance, still they were more interoperable and contributing more to some NATO operations than actual alliance members. And of course, they've built this up as their own independent security, their independent defense outside NATO. So there's a big difference between them and the other recently joining members in that they'll be a contributor of security. They have one of the strongest militaries, the strongest defense postures in the region. And so instead of being helped out by NATO, they're actually helping NATO by joining.
Sweden possibly in a slightly different position. Of course, the Swedish PM saying fairly recently that she was not inclined to join NATO because of a period of vulnerability. So, for example, they might be able to be formal invitees in 2 weeks, but you've got 6 to 12 months in which they are technically not protected by Article 5 under the NATO treaty. So what the UK PM has done, which is to step up and say, we will offer mutual aid should there be any attacks from Russia. Do we see other countries, NATO perhaps, stepping up to provide this kind of defense and protection as Sweden and Finland wait before they become officially members of NATO?
We haven't seen that yet. Who knows what we may see over the next few weeks. But it's always been the challenge that has faced these two countries. They know that being members of NATO would make their security situation far more stable, but it's the actual applying that would destabilize the situation. They've always been concerned about provoking reactions from Russia in that intervening period where they didn't have the full support of the alliance. Now, NATO member states, many of them would say that that is irrelevant because, of course, they will come to the aid of Sweden and Finland if they're under attack. So what we've seen from the UK is just a formalization of that. It's bridging the gap and making it more explicit, particularly for Russia, that these countries are not defenseless and do not have friends simply because they don't have the piece of paper that says they're members of NATO yet.
And looking at a final question here, the NATO summit in Madrid end of June, it has Jens Stoltenberg has come out to say this is a make or break summit. They need to be rethinking NATO's strategic concept. What do you see happening at the NATO summit in Madrid in June?
Well, yes, this is the biggest challenge to NATO since the last big challenge to NATO. We hear this talk about rethinking what NATO is for every time Russia reinvades one of its neighbors. So, yes, there probably will be, for a brief period, another concentration on exactly what it is that NATO needs to do. But the main impetus for European countries taking an interest in their own defense is, of course, what Russia does. For as long as President Putin keeps up these offensives, these wars of reconquests that he started in Ukraine in February, then that is what will galvanize all of this interest towards NATO actually rediscovering its role as the protector of European security.
And thanks for that, Kia Giles, Senior Consulting Fellow at Russia and Eurasia Program, Chatham House.